it's Jane, and I wanted to show you watercolor on vintage paper. If you've never tried this before, it might surprise you how well it works. What you need to do is test any old papers that you have before you start painting on them, just so you can get a little bit of an idea of how they will handle water, especially if they're like this paper that has actual handwritten notes. And yes, it is from 1863. That way, if the ink is going to run, at least you know about it before you start. I find a really fun way of loosening up my watercolor and to just jump into something is to draw with watercolor. And you can draw with watercolor by using watercolor crayons or watercolor pencils. So of course, the watercolor crayons that I'm using are my own ones. These are called Aquapastels. Basically, they're watercolor in a stick. You don't have to add watercolor to them. You can just leave them with that beautiful open crayon type line. But of course, when you add water to them, the pigment dissolves and you get a watercolor effect. All water-soluble medias tend to play well with each other. So if you draw in aquapastels or watercolor pencils, then you can also add your watercolor to them. Your lines will pretty much disappear. So if you're someone who loves the opportunity that an eraser gives you, this is another way of working with a different type of media that gives you that little extra opportunity to go back in time and make changes. Or equally, if you're like me, and I just love loose lines left on artwork. That's just my style, and it's just something that aesthetically pleases myself. So I can still get that look with the watercolor crayons or the aquapastels just by not adding more water, just keeping it a little refined. And of course, drawing with a dry media on vintage papers is a good way to start rather than going straight into it with watercolor and dousing the paper, just because it gives you a quicker workflow. You've got to let these old papers dry in between layers. But you might be surprised at how much vintage papers will actually let you douse them with watercolor. Now, of course, you have to keep in mind that watercolor plus paper equals paper mache. So you need to keep a little bit of a close eye on the papers as you go. And it's only natural that they will buckle a little bit, but you can flatten that out later on when everything is dry. If the paper starts to pill or really fall apart, that's when you need to use that as a stopping point. Learn as you go. You can test for that before you start. On this paper, this is a vintage ledger paper, and I've actually put a jelly plate print on this. I love jelly plates and getting the crusty old paints, old layers, seeing what happens. Then on top of this, just to give the paper a little bit of extra protection, I added some Liquitex matte varnish. Matte varnish, although it is matte and it does accept some water media, as you'll see, it does bead up, but it does dry on there eventually. Does it look the same as watercolor paper? No, it's going to look different. Will you need to experiment to learn and work on something that pleases you? Yeah, you will. And as a creative person and as an artist, that is super fun. This piece of paper is from Norway, I think, and it's a medical record or from a hospital. Again, it's about 60, 70 years old. And I'm using my water drawing technique that is in my book, Fabulous Figures, and you'll also find some extra videos right here on YouTube. In very basic terms, I draw with plain water and then drop watercolor or my incredible ink into the little shaped puddle of water, and it flows out. You can tip the paper around, but it works just as well on watercolor paper as on a vintage paper. This paper had a little bit of, not varnish, but a little bit of body, so the ink really flowed out quite nicely. Now back to those original two girls on this paper from 1863. Crazy. I have added a little bit of acrylic paint on the faces so that it just knocks back the background, the writing that's in the background there. And of course, I have let that dry so that I can add some of my pen on there. Always, the fastest way to destroy a pen is to use it on wet acrylic paint. So just make sure it's dry. Don't be impatient like me. But the vintage paper handles a little bit of acrylic very, very well. And I just love the opportunities that vintage papers just add to bringing out extra things in the imagination and the extra opportunities that they give. Sometimes they have extra texture. Sometimes, of course, they have these great backgrounds, or there's a story or words that you can springboard from in the artwork that you place on them. In general, I adore the scent of vintage papers, but sometimes they can get a little bit of a moldy or musky scent. The easiest way to get rid of that is to leave them out in the sunshine. That will usually make sure that any lingering old moldy smells evaporate completely. Watercolor is a perfect medium for vintage paper, I feel, because it is translucent. You're adding color, but you're not adding opacity unless you choose to, which is where I added the acrylic paint, one of my matte acrylic paints. So I could still work on top of it, but I'm just controlling the situation a little and adding my details. I usually work on several pieces at once, and this is for variety, to keep my eyes fresh, to keep the ideas coming, but also it allows each of those pieces time to dry. And I don't know about you, but I sometimes get excited and a bit impatient, and sometimes I push things before they're really dry enough. This helps me manage things so that they can dry, and I'm not pushing my poor pens to do things that they really shouldn't be doing. You can also try other mediums that you can then paint on top of. So you're not really painting on the vintage paper, but like here, I'm drawing on top of matte varnish. You could try matte medium, clear gesso, and there are some clear watercolor grounds. All of those options are particularly handy if the paper is very delicate, but each one reacts to watercolor and to different media in a completely different way. So it is a fun way to experiment. I hope this video has you looking at old scrap paper in a different way and inspires you to get creative with it.